Constitutional Conversations is a series of discussions by America's leading scholars about the principles, framing, ratification, and implementation of constitutional government in the United States. This series is hosted by the James Madison Memorial Fellowship Foundation of Alexandria, Virginia.
Somewhere in his memoirs, John Adams speculated, as he did about a lot of things, that Americans could be divided into, roughly equal thirds. A third for the revolution, a third opposed to it, in other words, loyalists to the British Empire, and a third who kind of wanted to sit the whole thing out or were kind of uncommitted or, bored by the whole thing or whatever. That's not a very satisfactory way to think about the role of the loyalists in the American Revolution. I mean, for one thing, one has to realize the active part of the revolution, let's say from the mid-1770s to the mid-1780s, you have essentially a decade, plus or minus a year or two here, of active political struggle. And it has ups and downs. It's not that people turned out in 1774 to check a box saying, I'm a Whig or I'm a patriot and I support the revolution. No, I'm a loyalist, I'm a Tory, I support the king. And a third saying, I'm just kind of bored by the whole thing. I think at the beginning it was very difficult to be a loyalist. I think at the beginning in 1774, when war breaks out in 1775, when independence was declared in 1776, loyalists have to be very careful. I mean, there are a few communities where potentially communities sufficiently divided that they can say what they think. Most communities in America, the Whigs, the Patriots, definitely have the advantage. And if you're a loyalist, you want to be very careful. You can be ostracized, you might be forced off your property, you might be scared away to seek protection from the British. But then as the war moves on, and the British had the great advantage the British had a terrific amount of mobility because they have a navy that allows them to go wherever they want in the countryside, and the Americans suffer some reverses, and, in particular moments, what Americans call the cause or the common cause was on the verge of collapse. There were periods and there were regions where loyalists could be more forthright. And the longer the British waged the war, the more they came to understand that if they could mobilize the loyalists in their behalf, they might actually have the basis for a successful strategy against the Americans. That was really the case after 1778. The American Revolution has kind of three phases. It starts off as what I call the police action in Massachusetts, trying to put down resistance there, 74, 75, early 1776. Then there's a set of about 2 years of essentially conventional military operations, army-to-army battles in New York and New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And then at the end and that kind of ends with the Battle of Monmouth in late June 1778. And then after that point, the British take the war south. They go to Georgia, then they attack South Carolina, North Carolina, eventually invade Virginia. And their strategy in doing this was partly to take advantage of the vast distances in the South. They could move their troops much more easily to the South than Washington could move, the kind of army that way. They take advantage of the presence of slaves, whose loyalty Americans know is very much up in question. Then they do take advantage of the fact that there were ethnic communities in the southern backcountry, in southern society, that were predisposed, that were inclined to support British authority. So at that point, the role of the loyalists becomes potentially quite intriguing and quite provocative. The British actually have what was in some ways a very sophisticated strategy about trying to beat the Americans in said battles in the South, and then use the loyalists to start to pacify the countryside, to try to restore pro-British rule in the Carolinas and Georgia, perhaps in Virginia, should that campaign have succeeded. The problem still was there weren't enough loyalists. What happened in the South was that strategy led to what looks much more like a genuine civil war, neighbor to neighbor, community to community, populations adjoining one another that are actively engaged in combat with one another. And when those conflicts took place, the Americans still had the advantage. And the loyalists were put in very precarious positions. So there's a kind of complicated story. It's not just that loyalism is one movement that people signed up for. at one point and consistently followed it. It develops over the course of the war. For a lot of the war, the Patriot leaders were much more worried about not about loyalism, but what they called disaffection. Very 18th century term, but you find in a lot of the letters. Disaffection meant a kind of waning of enthusiasm. Doesn't mean outright loyalty to the British. It means kind of a waning of enthusiasm for the common cause. And then the British, and so that's kind of the intermediate position. At the end of the 1770s, the British hit upon a strategy, which was a promising strategy. It represented pretty, creative thinking about the nature of the struggle they were waging. But they couldn't pull it off because there still weren't enough loyalists. And in fact, what they really do is they mobilize, the majority of the population of the South to support the Patriot cause. So they're a big part of the story. But I think they're never near a third of the population. Maybe best estimates are maybe a fifth.
Constitutional Conversations is made possible by a generous grant from the Fairleigh S. Dickinson Jr. Foundation. Constitutional Conversations is made possible by the James Madison Education Fund.